Greetings, Read My Mind Radio family. Welcome back to the podcast, bringing you compelling people impacted by all degrees of blindness and disability. You know we've been here since 2014, so make sure you take a look at the archives if you're new in these parts. My name is Thomas Reed, and I get to serve as host and producer. I like to consider each of these individual episodes as a part of a larger collective story. If you know of anybody new to blindness or disability in general, please go ahead and let them know what's happening here. I'm confident that they'll find a lot of value in the lived experiences stored in these audio files and transcripts, all just waiting for the right person. Today's episode is the latest addition to this growing archive that will not disappoint. So let's get down to it. Read my mind. Read my mind.
My story of blindness is, to take a page out of Michelle Obama's words, it's a story of becoming. My name is Qudsiya Naqui, and I am a lawyer, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am a South Asian woman. I'm quite petite. I'm about 5'1". Right now, I have dark brown, black hair that's very long because of the pandemic, and I haven't been able to cut it. I have kind of medium brown skin and brown eyes.
Qudsiya is the host of Down to the Struts, a podcast that explores the inner workings of disability design and its various intersections. Today, she shares some of the transformational experiences along her journey that helped shape her view of blindness. At 2 years old, Qudsiya was diagnosed with a congenital degenerative condition. By the time she began reading, standard print was sufficient.
But I had trouble in dark and dim places. We always lived in homes. We were blessed and fortunate to be able to live in homes that worked for me. So that had lots of sunlight and we had lots of extra lighting. So that was the way that we kind of helped make the environment accessible for me. And my mom was really proactive and had me in sort of rehabilitation services with the state agency.
That's the New Jersey State Commission for the Blind, where she received mobility training and other blindness skills as a child.
My usable vision was so good when I was young that I wasn't quite understanding sometimes like why I had to use a mobility cane, because oftentimes the trainer would come during the day and I could see really well during the day. When I reflect back on it, I'm like, why didn't they train me with the cane at night when I actually couldn't see? Then I would understand the benefit of it. I had a hard time explaining to people what my situation was, also because I present as sighted. I don't fit the sort of stereotypical appearance of what a blind person looks like. And so I sort of passed, for lack of a better word. And because I didn't have a vocabulary to talk about my disability, I didn't even use the word disability. It wasn't even in my lexicon when I was a child and a teenager and even a young adult. I really struggled.
As a child, struggling with bullying and making friends.
I do think it shaped a lot of my identity. I was quite introverted. I loved to read. It definitely did shape who I was when I was younger in slightly more negative ways. I felt like it was something I had to hide and that I had some degree of shame about. And that really affected my willingness and desire to engage socially and to make friends and to put myself out there.
There are two main perspectives in viewing disability. Whether you're familiar with them or not, you may recognize your own way of thinking. The medical model. This approach sees the problem as the illness, disease, or injury. The focus is on fixing the person.
I started losing vision really quite rapidly, kind of at the end of college when I was 22. At that same time, there was experimental gene therapy that became available. And my parents really were encouraging me. They had very good intentions and they loved me very much and they wanted me to feel good about myself and be successful. And their pathway towards that was to have this therapy that would help me either gain vision back or halt the degeneration. I did enroll in the clinical trial. I really believe that people should have choices about how they want to live. I have a little bit more healthy skepticism about that because so much of it is rooted in ableism, which is a term that I use a lot now but was really unaware of at that time.
That's the discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. It assumes that disabled people require fixing and defines people by their disability. Qudsiya says she's unsure if the therapy helped reduce the degeneration, but notes that she didn't regain any vision. She did, however, slowly begin inching toward that alternative way of viewing disability. But first, she had to go through some things.
I went through a really dark time in my 20s just trying to sort of, quote, fix myself. When I was younger, they told me that my vision would be stable. I had nothing to, quote, worry about, that it would just be the same as it was, and it was pretty doable.
While preparing to enter law school at Temple University, Qudsiya began seeing a new doctor who explained that her vision loss was degenerative.
That really explained what I was experiencing in the 2 or 3 years prior. Reading was starting to become really difficult. And so it was in law school. Law school is very difficult for a whole host of reasons. It's a difficult environment. It's just a lot of work. And there's a lot of reading, like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of reading a week.
Since grade school, Qudsiya prided herself on her ability to study hard and have the grades to reflect that effort. Her vision and grades both deteriorating, she considered dropping out.
And somehow I didn't. I had a couple of really amazing professors, and then I got a really cool internship at the ACLU of Pennsylvania the summer after my first year because I happened to meet the legal director at a career fair, and we just totally hit it off. And she was an incredibly supportive person. And between her and a couple of my professors, I stayed and I didn't quit and I didn't give up. That's when I started to explore text-to-voice software and the different kinds of technologies that were emerging. Blind people had been using them for years. I kind of taught myself to learn by listening. So I'd always been a visual learner, and I had to completely transform the way my brain worked. It took me a long time and it was hard, but I did it.
The grades improved. Her self-confidence returned, and she was making strides in her blindness journey.
Oftentimes, a lot of sighted techniques are foisted on you. There's always the imperative for you to use your eyes. But that was the first time I started to realize it's not about forcing me to use my eyes if my eyes aren't the most efficient way to get something done. I started to embrace non-sighted ways of doing things, which made me a lot more efficient and made things easier for me. The day that I said, I need to use JAWS 100% of the time, changed my life.
But what about accepting that white cane?
There was so much stigma for me associated with it, shame. I got myself into real difficulty. There was one time I was in Penn Station and I fell on the train tracks.
Thankfully, the train wasn't moving and someone quickly pulled her up. Although already familiar with proper cane technique, Qudsiya wasn't a practicing user. Living in New York City at the time, she reached out to the New York Commission for the Blind and got herself an orientation and mobility instructor.
I said, I need you to force me to use it in front of you until I get to a point where I'm okay with it in myself. We worked every day, a couple times a week for an hour. Little by little, after a while, I started to just feel comfortable with the cane. And I went from someone who would carry the cane folded up in their purse and never even think about it, and to a person who now uses a cane pretty much all day, all the time, and never is without it. And it has a very healthy relationship with it. That took a long time, and it took a lot of struggle and a lot of moving past my own stereotypes and my own ableism.
Qudsiya offers some additional thoughts on what could be helpful in decreasing the stigma associated with blindness and disability.
There's such a lack of education from a young age to acculturate children to the concept of disability and these disability positive messages. I just remember in high school, I never learned about the ADA. I never learned about the Rehab Act. I never learned about disability rights history. I feel if I had existed in an environment giving me all these positive messages and welcoming messages and accessible messages about who I was and the fact that who I was and my disability was okay, I think my outlook would have been quite different. But I was in an environment where my disability was sort of invisibilized. I see that changing now for young people, but I think we have a long way to go.
Another transitional moment along her blindness journey came when she experienced job discrimination.
That was really a turning point for me. That was the first time in my life I had been exposed to disability rights, disability law, and the civil protections that are available to people to prevent against discrimination. I didn't really understand that I had been repeatedly discriminated against in various work settings until I had this experience that became so extreme that I had to get an advocate to help me.
She credits that person with changing her life, helping her become clear about the problem and to see things from a different perspective.
Okay, it's not me that's the problem here. It's the system that's the problem. And it's a system that is not designed to give me access. And I need to fight for that access.
The social model of disability. This views disability as a part of life and not the problem. Rather recognizing that society erects barriers in various ways that can limit opportunities. Qudsiya not only learned how to advocate for herself, she found a community of people who also had a positive outlook on their own blindness and disability. Moving to Washington, D.C. from New York City, she was introduced to another blind lawyer.
She and I actually connected over something completely unrelated to blindness. We connected over the fact that we were both athletes. She was a cyclist and a runner, and I was a runner also. And she was starting up this sports group in DC called the Metro Washington Association of Blind Athletes. And she kept encouraging me to come and try out tandem cycling. I hadn't been on a bike since I was a little kid. I didn't know anything about tandem. I was like, this is going to be a disaster. Finally, she pushed me and I went, and I got really into it. I just fell in love with it.
That led to other sports and activities like adaptive rock climbing, guided running, and most importantly, friendships with other blind people.
That was really transformative, mostly because I never had blind friends in my life. I suddenly had this massive, wonderful, supportive, fantastic community of other blind people that were doing all sorts of things, had all sorts of professions, came from all different types of backgrounds. We just had fun together and we supported each other.
That support is invaluable, from the practical to the emotional, helping you become your best self.
I'm like a B- blind person and I'm trying to get to an A+.
I think she's being tough on herself. Even if we're not being graded, a community of people to learn and share with along any journey is important.
I started on that journey kind of later in life as opposed to some of my peers who were born blind or lost their vision when they were really young. They really became resources to me, and I just started to see the world really differently. I'm also part of another new group that just started last summer. It's called Walk World, WOC, and it's a group for blind women of color, a virtual community of blind women to support blind women of color.
I always like to highlight the importance of meeting people. That's what this podcast is all about, because not everyone is in an area where they can actually have access to all of these people. And so that transition process that I think really is impacted by meeting people may take even longer because you have no sort of model of what blindness can actually be. Qudsiya is a fellow podcaster. She's the founder and host of Down to the Struts.
A strut is like an engineering device that's used to like hold stuff together. It sort of evokes this idea of what are the building blocks, what holds the world together, and how do we need to change what holds the world together, and how do we need to change structures and systems. I wanted to make non-disabled people see why they need to think about things from a disability lens and why that's important and why we should care about it.
While she was being pushed to write and publish law review articles, she found her heart just wasn't in it. Already a consumer of audio content, including books and podcasts, she recognized the opportunity to explore some of her interests and expertise.
The article I was working on was about disability, specifically disability and its intersection with immigration, which is one of my areas of expertise as a lawyer. I was like, well, I really care about this topic. I really care about disability and its intersections with other types of things like race or other types of policy issues like disability and employment, disability and healthcare. I am a person who has experience with like policy and research and these sorts of things. And I have audio content and it's a pandemic and I'm sitting at home and I got nowhere to go and nothing to do. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to do it. That's how Down to the Struts was born.
Occasionally, I'm asked about starting a podcast. My advice closely aligns with the steps that Qudsiya lays out.
I decided I wanted to do an interview-style show and bring a mix of sort of people with lived experience, people who are experts in their fields, to talk about sort of very broadly speaking, disability design and intersectionality. I got a team of people together. I don't know how to design a website. I don't know how to audio edit. So I got a lot of brains together. At first, it was just for advice, but then a couple of friends of mine really wanted to be involved and wanted to work on it. I was so touched by their desire to be supportive. They just loved the idea of the project and they contributed their skills and talents to it. I had a focus group of a whole bunch of friends that helped me vote on the title. We launched our first season in October of 2020, and there's 6 episodes.
She narrowed her subject, figured out what aspects best fit her skills and interests, assembled others, and ended up with a team. She's also using a seasonal approach, which I highly recommend. It takes away some of the stress of producing regular content. And of course, she got feedback on her podcast name. And did I mention she has herself a team?
I went to Barnard College, the women's college that's part of Columbia University. I went looking for a student who was interested in audio editing, so that's how I came across Anna Wu, who's a junior at Barnard. She brought along her friend, Adrienne Kong, who does our transcripts. I have 2 other friends. Ilana Nevins is our audio editor, and my friend Avery Anapol, who is a fabulous social media coordinator and manages all my Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, so I don't have to. I am scared of social media.
Yeah, I'll admit it. I'm a bit envious of her team. A lot of thought and planning went into the creation of Down to the Struts. Ultimately, it's figuring out what you want. I get this sense that this is how Qudsiya operates.
I realized very, very quickly that I did not want to be a practicing attorney. I think I probably even knew that before law school, but I knew I was interested in immigration and I knew I was interested in kind of policy. A lot of the policy people were like, well, you can't really fix the system if you don't understand the experience of people who are going through it. So I did practice immigration law, representing asylum seekers and survivors of domestic violence. And then I went to a different organization where I was managing the program that was delivering services to unaccompanied children who were in federal custody on the border and in other parts of the country.
She continued doing that work for a different organization while expanding into disaster recovery and other areas.
Now, most recently, I'm at a big research policy institution working on civil court reform work. So making this civil court system for people who experience evictions and debt collection lawsuits and have to deal with child support cases and things like that. So making the system more accessible, especially for people who don't have lawyers. And I bring a lot of my disability kind of focus in there too, because especially with all the technology in courts, a big concern is making sure everything's accessible. I feel like it all kind of bleeds together.
What do you want people to sort of take away from your podcast? What would you want them to leave thinking / doing?
For disabled people, I want them to leave the podcast feeling like their issues are being addressed, that I'm exposing and uncovering the barriers they face and providing positive solutions and proactive solutions to how we can break down those barriers and fix those problems. For the non-disabled people who listen to my podcast, I want their eyes to be opened to how the systems and structures that we live inside, whether that's the immigration system, whether that's the education system, whether that's healthcare, how they affect disabled people and how ableism plays a role in that, so that they can walk away and say, here's these problems, there's solutions to solve them. I want that information to get out to the people who are the decision makers and the stakeholders in those systems so that they can start to make change.
Think about the importance of all the transitional moments Qudsiya experienced. From her battle with the white cane to experiencing discrimination on the job, which led to her meeting people who would come to positively influence her life. Combine these experiences with her own positive attitude and drive, and consider her advice for those new to vision loss.
Everyone has their own journey and their own experience and their own way of going through those stages of grief and getting to the other side, whatever the other side looks like. That's okay. And you have to be kind to yourself, but know that there's a community waiting for you and there's a lot of possibility and that you are a whole person and your blindness is a part of that. It is a really beautiful part of that. That's something that you should honor about yourself.
Qudsiya, you know that you are now an official, and I'm going to say it twice, an official member of the Read My Mind radio family now that you've been on the podcast. You know that, right?
Oh, that's awesome. I'm honored. Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me into the family.
Absolutely. To get in contact with Qudsiya and or where to find the podcast,
email us at downtothestruts@gmail.com. You can find our website, which is www.downtothestruts.com. We are also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Down to the Struts. And you can subscribe, rate, review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you love to listen.
Spoken like a true podcaster right there. I really like the way Qudsiya identifies and appreciates the different moments throughout her journey for the value they help bring to her life. Once again, shout out to Qudsiya. I really enjoyed this conversation. If you too enjoyed it, well, you can always feel free to let me know that or any other comments you may have by emailing me at readmymindradio@gmail.com. Tell others about the podcast so they can listen for themselves. All I want to do here is to reach as many people experiencing vision loss as early as possible. You know, we have transcripts and more over at readmymind.com, right? And I know you know that I know you know it's R to the E, I,
D, and that's me in a place to be.
Like my last name. Peace.